Author opinion of Dennis Keane at the history, geography and architecture, culture and life manners of Kazakhs in the program Discovering Kazakhstan.
On today's program, a small town with a big footprint. A holiday escape for coal miners. A lake with a tragic story.
Salam, привет, and hello. I'm Dennis Keane, and today on Discovering Kazakhstan, we will be discovering a scenic and historic town in central Kazakhstan, Karakarli. Karakarli was once a major point on the trading routes from China to Russia. And when it became part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, it was one of the most important settlements in this part of the country. Nowadays, it's a pretty quiet, sleepy town, but with the Karakarli National Park nearby, it's a common getaway for people from the nearby city of Karaganda. This is a part of the country with a lot to discover, so come along as we explore this hidden gem.
Karakarli is a town that rewards every kind of explorer. If you like exploring nature, the national park is one of the finest in the country. If you like exploring towns, then Karakarli has more sights than its small size would suggest, from colorful historic homes to beautifully decorated civic buildings.
For such a small town, Karakarli has a surprising amount of public art, including what's known as monumental art, Soviet mosaics and bas-relief sculptures that were made in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s to glorify the communist system or just to depict scenes of Kazakh traditional life. One such mosaic can be found on the House of Culture in Karakarli, and it turns out that it was made by one of Kazakhstan's most legendary monumental artists, a man named Vladimir Tverdoklebov. He designed it in 1973 and 1974, came here all the way from Almaty and installed his work on the side of this building, and to this day it's in fantastic condition. On another part of the building, Tverdoklebov made what's called a bas-relief, a kind of three-dimensional sculptural facade made out of concrete. Because this was the House of Culture where they would have concerts and performances, he chose a musical theme, with three young girls playing musical instruments. What I like about the bas-relief is that even though it's made from this heavy concrete, it is full of movement. You have birds fluttering up above, and the flowing locks of the girl's hair echoes the flowing wheat that represents Soviet agriculture. Walking the quiet streets of Karakarli, you'll find so many examples of beautiful wooden architecture from the 19th century, but there's one house that stands out. I love it for its beautifully carved wooden window frames that we call nalishniki. It's unusual gable that's been carved and painted there above the floor, but most interestingly, these columns made of logs here at the entrance, giving it a classical touch that's rarely seen in buildings from this period. But the building is renowned locally more for the famous people who lived here. A local merchant named Khaliola Bekmetov and his family friend, a young poet named Abay Kunbayev.
Khaliola Abay, as Bekmetov was known, came from a well-off Tatar family and quickly made a name for himself in 19th century Karakarlinsk, working with caravans that would stop by on their way from China to Russia. Bekmetov was a rich man of his time who obviously built a beautiful home, but his legacy would be superseded by that of a young boy named Abay, who would go on to be known as the greatest of all Kazakh writers. Abai and his father stayed in Bekmedev's home when Abai was just a young boy, though he was an impressionable one, surrounded by poets and musicians who would perform at nearby fairs.
Nowadays, the building is occupied by a local department of culture, and what a space they have, with these big rooms and high ceilings. But it would have been hard to keep this kind of space warm in the cold Karakarli winters, which is why they have these old stoves called kontramarkas. You would just feed this up here with some coal, and it would heat this entire space. Most of the house's rooms are now offices, but one room has been set aside and dedicated to Abai. Here you can see some portraits of the great poet and some busts of his likeness. You can find some family trees of Abai and his father. These family trees called Sherjire have always been a big tradition in Kazakh culture as a way to keep in touch with where you came from and to know your ancestors. But perhaps the most interesting part of the room is this little setup here, where they've tried to recreate a kind of yurt that you would have seen during Abai's era. This kind of lattice work here is the walls of the yurt. It's called the kirege. And on the kirege we can see various kind of totems that symbolize parts of Kazakh masculinity. So you have a shield that kind of represents the soldier in every Kazakh man, the warrior. You have a dombra, the two-stringed Kazakh lute that represents Abai's musicality. You have the kamshi, a kind of horse whip that would be used by shepherds and horseback riders. And then here we have a fox fur, which would have been caught by a hunter here in the mountains around Karakarli. And Abai himself was actually a famous kind of hunter, one who hunted with golden eagles, what they call a berkuchi. The Kunanbai Kaji Mosque has been a Karakarli landmark ever since it was built more than a century and a half ago, in 1851. It too is associated with the name of the poet Abai, as it was built by and named after his father.
His son would go on to become a legendary cultural figure in Kazakhstan, but the man named Kunanbai Uskenbayev was a pivotal figure in his own right, a famous orator and political figure who would be the first to be elected to the office of Chief Sultan, who was not from the so-called white bone aristocracy. He served his post from 1849 to 1853 in Karakarli, and he left the wooden mosque as his legacy.
The mosque was a two-story log building that attracted the faithful from all around the Karakarli region. But in 1928, during the anti-religion campaigns of the early Soviet Union, the mosque was shut down and its minaret destroyed. It was used as a school and for storage, and by the 1980s, it was abandoned and in poor condition. It was then that the local authorities decided to do some major renovations, and the mosque is now in great shape. A particularly interesting example of wooden Islamic architecture from central Kazakhstan. A fascinating element of this mosque is its mihrab. This is a niche that is found in every mosque that points the way towards Mecca, and is often elaborately decorated. But this is the first time that I've ever seen one carved out of wood, reflecting the abundance of timber from local forests and the skills of the local craftsmen who worked on the renovation. Many of the logs were so rotten after decades of neglect that during the renovation they had to put in new wooden slats on the facade and the interior. But if you want to get an idea of what the mosque originally would have looked like, there's one section where if you look up at the ceiling, you can see the original planks, darkened with age. When you're looking at Tsarist-era architecture in Karakarli, you'll see two main styles. Some homes are made out of wood, like the Bekmetov house that we saw earlier. But there's a whole other style that's made out of brick. And though brick is a less pliable material than wood, it's amazing what masons could do with it. One of the finest examples of brick architecture in the city is this house that belonged to a merchant named Andrei Ryazantsev. Little is known these days about Ryazantsev, but the house is more famous for a man who stayed here, Grigory Potanin, a famous Russian ethnographer who came in 1913 to Karakarli to study Kazakh folk stories. Karakarelians are a very literate people, so much so that they have not one but two libraries, one for kids and one for adults. The adult library that's inside the Ryazantsev house is just the place for me because they have stack after stack of books about local history. So you can come talk to the local librarians, and if you want to learn more about Karakarli history, you can find some books and do some reading. Whenever I go to smaller towns in Kazakhstan, I always like to drop by the Regional History Museum. You can almost always find these places, and you can learn a lot about the local history, but also they're just always full of really cool old antiques. And this place is no exception. When you've been to enough of these regional history museums, you realize that there's a certain rhythm, a certain structure to how they're designed. And it's usually chronological, moving from the Stone Age to ancient eras to the modern day. And the museum in Karakarli is no different. In the very first room, you're dealing with the ancient ancestors of Kazakh people who lived on this territory. You can see some kind of clay pot that they left behind, different kind of metal tools, and try to imagine what would have been like here even before this modern town was founded. Next, it's on to the medieval era, which was dominated by fighting between Kazakhs and invading tribes. So we can learn about the Kazakh warriors who defended their territory, famous batyrs like Kozhan Batyr. And in one corner, you can see the kind of weaponry that these batyrs might have used, which are surprisingly well preserved here through the centuries. For example, I've never seen this kind of chainmail like this in such fine condition. I'm also impressed by these clubs here called shokpar, long poles with these gnarly ends that Kazakh warriors would have used to beat down their enemies. Then we come to my favorite part, the so-called ethnographic section, where you can learn about everyday life in the 18th and 19th centuries. Back then, of course, Kazakhs were nomads, and so they've set up a little mini yurt here where you can see various items that you would have once found inside of a Kazakh home. My eyes were attracted to this coat over here, made out of fox furs. Karakarli is a place that was famous for hunting, and I'm sure there would have been plenty of eagle hunters here who would have headed up into the hills, caught some foxes, and eventually used them to make this kind of trophy coat. But the kitchenware is especially interesting over here. You have this kind of leather bag that would have been used to make khumuz, or fermented horse milk. You have a giant kind of pestle here that you can use to grind up some flour, or you can use this big mill here made of stone. But perhaps The most interesting thing that I never say before is this butter churn, entirely made out of wood. But all of those kind of everyday items you can find in lots of regional history museums in Kazakhstan. There are some objects here that you can only find in Karaköy, and I'm talking about these huge metal safes. Check out this thing here. It's made from thick cast iron. It's a good place, I think, to hide away during a nuclear apocalypse. And if you look at the bottom, you can even see who made it. A guy named Miller said it was made in Moscow in 1857. This one looks like it's made out of wood, but it's actually made out of metal. And it is one kind of strong container there for storing away your gold and treasure. Now, in such a small town like Karaköy, why would people have needed these big, heavy metal safes to store away their cash? It's all because of something called the Koyandi Fair.
The Koyandi Fair started as a livestock auction in 1848 and grew to be something like a massive convention that even had its own convertible currency, a 2-year-old ram that was equivalent to 2 rubles in silver. Nomads from all around the Kazakh steppe would drive their herds to the pastures of Koyandi and Karaköy to trade in their cattle for goods, part of a kind of late Silk Road trade in goods that were flowing from China to Kazakhstan to Russia. Nowadays, Karaköy still attracts people from miles around, but rather than a business destination for nomads, it's a place famous with holiday goers.
Karaköy has long been a popular vacation destination for people from Karaganda, a major Kazakhstani city just a few hours away. Karaganda is famous for its mining industry, and after spending several weeks underground, miners would be sent here to beautiful places like Lake Pashino, where they could rest and recover. All around the lake are a series of what are called dom otokha, houses of rest, which were built during the Soviet period so that workers could come and recuperate before heading back into the workforce. We may not have spent much time underground on this trip, but we're going to do it like locals and see what it's like to stay at one of these special resorts. It's interesting that even though those Karaganda mines and these Karaköy resorts are no longer owned by the state, but actually by an international mining company, they still send their workers here the same way they have for generations. I think after being so long down below the earth in the darkness, it must have been such a relief to come to a place like this that is so bright and with such high peaks. Oh, the squirrels at this dom otokha, the house of rest, are actually famous for being very outgoing. And there were some warnings that you should be careful when you're around them because they might get a little bit too excited. But this guy seems perfectly friendly to me. I've never seen a squirrel with that kind of outgoing attitude before. Part of the daily routine at the House of Rest is coming to the cafeteria to have your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There's no menu to make any choices from. Everything is just served there, ready for you to eat, and it's all healthy and traditional recipes. So here, for example, we have some nice fresh salad. We've got a standard, which is cooked buckwheat with a cutlet, some kind of meat patty there. We have a drink here, which is some kind of hibiscus tea called karakade. And then a nice soup. So you see, it's always a multi-course meal, more than enough to keep you nourished while you're busy expending all your energy resting. A short drive from Karakareli, in a valley called Komisarovka, there's an idyllic site. A beautiful blue lake surrounded by pristine forest, and on the shore, the finest example of wooden architecture in Kazakhstan. It's called the Forester's House because it was built from 1910 to 1913 for the local forester, a man named L.S. Sadovichny. For years now, it seems that it's been empty. Looking through, it's as if it used to be some kind of information center. But there's no worries because the house is actually on a list, a register of historic buildings in Kazakhstan. So there's some hope that in the future it will be open for visitors. At the edge of the Karakareli National Park, there is a nature museum housed inside of a beautiful wooden building where you can acquaint yourself with the flora and fauna that are to be found inside this one-of-a-kind preserve. Unlike the rest of central Kazakhstan, which is as flat as a pancake, Karakareli is an oasis of hills. That makes it especially good for nature lovers and hikers. But before you get out there, it's good to acquaint yourself with the topography. That's why it's wonderful that at the Nature Museum you can find this kind of topographical relief map that they've made, and you can try to figure out where you are and where you're going. So from this map, we can realize actually that the town of Karakareli, which is right here, is surrounded on all sides by mountains. And you can understand why they wanted to build it here. It is so well protected and surrounded by a beautiful landscape that you couldn't think of a better place to have a town in this part of the country. Throughout the former USSR, there are hundreds of old nature museums, and in each one, there are hundreds of taxidermied specimens. I can understand why these museum staffs would want to have a taxidermist, because when you have these animals here preserved in such good condition, it really makes you feel as if they're alive. Especially when you're here in front of these big animals like boars and wolves and elks. Your adrenaline starts to pump as you feel like you're in the presence of a predator. But of course, as fun as it is to look at the stuffed animals inside the Nature Museum, it's even more thrilling to see these wild creatures close up. And next to the museum, they have something called the volair, a kind of wildlife habitat where you can get right up close to these animals. They have this tower, you just climb to the top of the tower, and from over here, we can see beautiful bison ranging out on the grasslands, and over there, what are called fallow deer.
The first bisons here arrived in 1988 from Russia, but it's said that they had originally been brought from Arizona. To this day, there is a small family of happy American bison living in the 83 hectares of the volair. The fallow deer aren't as huge as the bison and are a little more skittish, but the buck's big antlers, grown to attract mates, never fail to attract tourists as well.
But even better than standing up on the platform with that amazing view, you can actually get up close and personal with these animals. He just licked my finger. Come here. I wanted to feed him some biscuits. Hey. Psst, psst. Yeah. Oh my gosh. He's so... You know, I've fed cows before, but I've never fed a bison, and their tongues are humongous. Hey. But still, they kind of strike me as gentle creatures. Hey. You didn't like it? Have another one. For exploring Karkarli National Park, a WAZ is indispensable. These old Soviet trucks used to be used for ambulances, and though the ride can be a bit bumpy, you know that you're going along in style. The rest of the way, though, we have to go on foot. There's a pretty good trail cleared here through these conifers, but if you ever do feel like you don't know the way, all you have to do is look around, and not far, you'll find these red arrows showing you the path forward. I've been hiking in other parts of the world where people come from the city to go picnic in the forest, and they leave a mess everywhere. There are Snickers wrappers and beer bottles, but you'll notice the trails here in Karkarli National Park are impeccably clean. And it must be thanks to these trash cans that are strapped to trees every few hundred meters. I don't envy the person who has to hike up here and empty the bags every once in a while, but they'll get good karma. The rocks here are unlike anything I've ever seen before. You can go in them, over them, under them, because they're arranged like these wobbly stacks of pancakes, or like a kid decided when he was playing with some molding clay that he was going to make a mountain. So he made layer after layer after layer of these things. And it gives them this really neat, playful kind of appearance. So I have finally arrived at the top of our hike, and check out the reward, this beautiful lake that seems to have been made in some kind of crater at the peak of this hill. And all around are those same beautiful rocks, blue sky, and the water is so tranquil. But I was surprised to learn that the lake actually has an unusual name. It's called Satan Lake, and in a minute I'll tell you why. Before today, I had actually never heard this story about why Satan Lake was called the way it is, but I had heard another legend about this place, a legend that is known all around Kazakhstan, called Sulushash. It's a tragic love story about a young girl named Sulushash and her partner Altai, who are forbidden to get married by Sulushash's father. So they decide to elope, and along with Altai's friend Kausar, they head up into the mountains around Karkarli and eventually decide to set up camp here, next to Shaitan-Kol. Altai and his friend Kausar decide to go hunting for Argali sheep in the rocks nearby. They are having a terrific time. Sulushash is here, bathing in the water. Everything is great. But then Kausar falls from a cliff and dies, the first tragedy in the story. And Altai is distraught. But meanwhile, Sulushash's father is furious that they've decided to elope, and he's chasing them through the mountains, and he eventually decides to burn down this forest in order to smoke them out. So Sulushash is choking from the smoke. She goes to hide inside of a cliff. She's scared. Altai is no longer by her side. She can barely breathe, and eventually she just can't stand it, and she runs out of this cave towards the lake looking for some kind of safety. When she gets to the shore of the lake, she sees a tiger, and terrified, she jumps into the water and drowns. When Altai finally arrives at Shaitan-Kol, all he sees is the hat of his lover, and so depressed at the circumstances, he plunges a dagger into his heart, ending this tragic story. From the rocks across the lake, not only is there a beautiful view of the surrounding scenery, but there are these majestic trees, on the branches of which people have tied little rags and pieces of cloth, an ancient Central Asian tradition to make prayers to the gods and the ancestors. As usual, I'm going to make a wish for you. I wish that you have enjoyed coming along with me as we've explored Karkarli, and I wish that you will keep on discovering Kazakhstan. Till next time, Saubal, Baka, and goodbye.